Yeah, okay, I'll make it much briefer this time. Hi, I'm Zoe. Thank you guys so much for coming. If you have questions, please save them for the end. I tried to make this really easy to understand. There might be questions. That's okay. I talk really fast. If I talk too fast, let me know. I'll slow down. Little history, some context. The endocannabinoid system has a very long history, and we're going to shove it into 3 slides. First things first, evolutionary history. So the endocannabinoid system is present in all vertebrates, and it's present in more than just vertebrates. In fact, components of the endocannabinoid system have been found in everything from humans to fungi. But the endocannabinoid system, as we understand it now, it exists in all chordates, which is a specialized genus of animals that includes vertebrates and also things like the sea squirt, which is not a vertebrate, it is very squishy. But that has an endocannabinoid system. So chordates evolved around 530 million years ago. Vertebrates evolved around 525 million years ago. Our researchers are hesitant to put an exact pinpoint on when the endocannabinoid system evolved, which is fair. We don't actually have any way to tell. But that's a little taste of how old this system is. As I was reading, one of my favorite researchers, Dr. John McPartland, he had this lovely quote about the evolution of the endocannabinoid system that I just wanted to read to you. So, over evolutionary time, we see duplications and mutations of the endocannabinoid receptors and ligands. The symbol for endocannabinoid evolution is not a bifurcating tree, but an interweaving arabesque of co-evolving receptors and ligands. So, right? Isn't that beautiful? That's lots of words. We'll get into what all of those things mean, but that just means this system evolved in many different species at many different times in many different ways for many different reasons. And then we ended up with it, and it's complicated. All right, so moving on to slightly more modern times, the timeline. This is important in understanding why we understand what we do and don't about the endocannabinoid system. So, 1964, Raphael Mechoulam elucidated the structure of THC. Just so you know, 1963, the structure of CBD was elucidated. And then nothing. For a long time, scientists thought that the phytocannabinoids like THC worked through a non-specific membrane-associated action, which is about as specific as it sounds. So they didn't really know. It had something to do with lipids, it did some cool stuff, and there wasn't really funding, and so they moved on. And then, in the 80s, NIDA was like, marijuana is bad. Let's prove that it's bad by funding it. All right, find out what's bad about marijuana. And that backfired. So in 1988, in Dr. Alan Hollett's lab, using NIDA funding, they discovered the first endocannabinoid receptor. So almost 3 decades later, they found the first endocannabinoid receptor for THC. And then they were like, it's weird that we have this thing in our bodies that only interacts with a plant. Why could that be? And then they found the first endocannabinoid a couple of years later. Then they found the second endocannabinoid receptor. Then they found the second endocannabinoid. And we've gone on from there. But that's all to say, this is, 30 years old. This field of research is really new, and it changes really fast. Which brings me to, I am not a scientist, I am not a researcher, I am not a doctor. This research changes really fast. I read a lot of it all the time. If you hear something and you're like, that's wrong, A, tell me because I want to know. And B, just know that it changes a lot. And there are a lot of conflicting information about this system. So if I say something that sounds wrong, let's explore it. Okay, so moving on to where is the endocannabinoid system? This is important because the endocannabinoid system can do so many different things. We hear about it being involved in all of these different disease states, and a lot of that has to do with where it is. So it is found in the nervous system, the immune system, and fat, skin, bone, circulating cells, your digestive system, your reproductive system. It's found everywhere. And so I want to start with, does anyone know what the nervous system does?
It makes you nervous.
Right now it makes you nervous. Anyone? Not Ethan. Go for it.
So the
the nervous system basically controls our nervous perceptions to all of our organs, all of our extremities, everything really.
Yeah.
It's how we feel, see, smell, taste, all of it, the whole 9 yards.
Hell
and
yeah.
how we continue to breathe even though I'm not concentrating on breathing.
Exactly. That was an excellent description of what the nervous system does. It is the way that our body communicates and regulates a lot of other systems. There are two parts to the nervous system. There's the central nervous system, which is your brain and your brainstem, spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is all of the nerves that run throughout the body. So the central nervous system is like the communication hub. It receives signals from all over the body, and then it sends out other signals telling the body what to do. It organizes all that information and regulates everything. The peripheral nervous system is responsible for communicating that information to and from the central nervous system. This is important because the nervous system does things like regulate our breathing, or our heart beating, or us looking at our arm and being like, I want to open my hand. Cool, I opened my hand. It did it. That's awesome. That's your nervous system at work. The other system that's super important when we talk about the endocannabinoid system is the immune system. So the immune system, pretty straightforward. We all are pretty familiar every winter with our immune systems and what they do. And it's not just make us feel really shitty for a while. It is, they are trying to protect us from invaders. And there are a bunch of different parts of the immune system. The parts that we're particularly interested in for the endocannabinoid system are the B and T cells, which are like the warrior cells of the immune system. They like go around your body and they're like, you, invader, die, which is cool. Also bone marrow, really important in the immune system. The endocannabinoid system is also in your bone marrow. Cool. And all of these other systems. So this is the reason that when we talk about cannabis and cannabis being therapeutic for a number of different things that are really not very closely related, this is one of the reasons it could be therapeutic for all of those things, because there are so many places that it could interact throughout the body. In fact, the endocannabinoid system has been expressed in every organ and in every system that's been looked at so far, with the exception of there's a respiratory center in our brain and it's not there, but it is in most parts of our brain, not all of them. We'll talk about it. Okay, so question you've all been waiting for. What is the endocannabinoid system? I'll start using ECS for endocannabinoid system. It's just a little bit faster. There's a lot of words on this screen, and there's also, it's a really good question. That's why we're here. We're going to talk about the endocannabinoid system as it's classically understood. There is a lot of information about the endocannabinoid system that is evolving really, really rapidly, and we'll touch on that at the end. But for today, we're going to talk about the two classical endocannabinoid receptors, cannabinoid receptor type 1, CB1, cannabinoid receptor type 2, CB2. They're endogenous ligands, which are the compounds that our body creates to bind to those receptors, and then the enzymes that synthesize and metabolize those ligands. So those are the enzymes that give birth to and break down the compounds that bind to the endocannabinoid receptors. We're going to go into each one of those again. Don't worry. There's also a lot of other parts to the endocannabinoid system. We'll touch on all of that at the end. We're going to focus on these three parts, starting with receptors. So this question is near and dear to my heart. I started at a dispensary because I needed a job. I was applying to PhD programs in sociology, and I had 2 days of training, and I walked out of my science training and I was like, we have an endocannabinoid system, it's some receptors on cells somewhere. I don't know what a receptor is. What is a receptor? What is a cell? What is a neuron? And then that's when the rabbit hole started. So I love this question. A receptor, let me see what image I put first. Yes, okay, cool. This is an image of a receptor, an actual image, an illustration of a receptor. And I think that this is important because oftentimes people will just be like, oh, it's like this thing, but it actually looks like that. A receptor is a tiny protein on the surface of a cell that compounds engage with to tell the cell to do something or to not do something. They allow compounds to have impacts on the cell. The largest family, there are 4 families of receptors. The ones that we're going to be talking about tonight are G protein coupled receptors. CB1 and CB2 are both GPCRs. That all doesn't matter, it's gobbledygook. What does matter is GPCRs are the target of like 40% of medicines. They are really widespread throughout your body. They are one of the oldest families of receptors, and CB1 is one of the most common G protein coupled receptors in our brains, which is kind of crazy. Okay, so this is a little illustration that I made. It's not very good, but it does the job. So CB1 and CB2 are widely expressed throughout the body. You can see we've got the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system there. CB1, actually let's just go to that slide. All right, here we go. Cannabinoid receptor type 1. Now we've got a focus on it. So that picture of the receptor is a CB1 receptor. G protein coupled receptors have 7 protein strands that go from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. When compounds bind to the protein, or to the receptor, they bind right here. They make the receptor change a little bit, and then a bunch of chemistry happens and it makes the cell go. CB1 receptors are most prevalent and most densely populated in the brain, and in many, many areas of the brain that are responsible for memory, reward systems, attention, emotional responses. That's a lot of what we focus on when we talk about CB1. CB1 is what makes you feel high when you smoke weed. It is a very important receptor. It was the first one discovered. And it plays a major role in pain perception, which is why THC can help some people feel less pain. It seems to do that by altering our emotional perception of pain, which is kind of interesting and might explain why some people feel more pain, because they start to notice it more. Because it's not actually killing the pain. Anyway, it's also present on the olfactory bulb, in the reproductive system, and on the skin. Moving on to cannabinoid receptor type 2. I'm so excited that I found a picture of this receptor. When I was looking for a picture of this receptor a couple years ago, one wasn't available. And I found one, and it was through Creative Commons. So here it is. It is just 7 protein strands again, but it's actually the CB2 receptor. And it has something binding in it, which is really cool. That green thing is, where a compound binds. This is important. Receptors are 3-dimensional shapes, and 3-dimensional shapes bind to them. And those 3-dimensional shapes are different shapes. And so when those shapes come together and change, they have different effects. CB2 is most prevalent in our immune system. So it's found on B cells in our immune system, and it is really important in regulating inflammation throughout the body. CB2 does not make us feel high, but it is of particular interest to many, many researchers who want to tap into the benefits of cannabis without feeling high. Unfortunately, that's really hard. They are very closely related. For a long time, and this is really controversial, CB2 was thought to not be present in the brain at all, but there is some evidence to suggest that it is present in the brain, and it might serve an immunoprotective function up there. But again, very controversial. This is like where we're at with the endocannabinoid system. All right, moving on to endogenous ligands. All right, endogenous ligands, let's break it down. Endo means within, ligands means a compound that binds. So these are compounds that bind to the receptors found within our bodies. Endogenous is the opposite of exogenous. So an exogenous ligand would be something from outside of your body that binds to a receptor. A cannabinoid, a phytocannabinoid, a cannabinoid from plants would be an excellent example of this. So I started looking at receptors and ligands, and it was just like words. But these are actually really important words. And so I made a little diagram explaining what they are as Star Wars characters. Okay, so receptors tell the cell. Cells do specific things. We don't know why they do those things. They just do the things that they do, which is cool. But they won't do those things without some motivation. And that motivation comes in the form of compounds, or in this case, Star Wars characters. So in this case, the cell's action restores balance to the Force, which is the whole premise of Star Wars. I really hope everyone has seen this movie, otherwise this analogy really doesn't work. Okay, so Luke Skywalker, our hero of the moment, would be an agonist. So an agonist is a compound that binds to a receptor, and that tells the cell to go, do your thing, you're awesome, you're gonna go do it now. That's Luke Skywalker. He's gonna restore balance to the Force by activating the receptor on the cell. The opposite of that would be an antagonist. So an antagonist binds to the receptor still, but it tells the cell, don't go, and also nothing else can bind here, so nothing can activate you, more or less. And that was a little harder, so it's like if the movies didn't get funding, or like if Luke didn't get funding, if he just like stayed on his farm with his aunt and uncle forever, that would be the antagonist. So like the story just doesn't happen. This can be really important for like when a system is overactive. If you want to like calm it down a little bit, you can introduce an antagonist to a system and make the receptors chill the heck out. We also have allosteric modulators. So agonists and antagonists bind to the primary binding site on a receptor, which again is right here in the middle. Sometimes other compounds will bind to other sites on the side of the receptor and they'll change the shape of the receptor, but they won't activate it, not really. But what they do when they change the shape is they can make things that bind to it work more or less well. So when something changes the shape of a receptor and makes it work better with the things that bind and activate it, it's called a positive allosteric modulator. So this compound is changing the shape of the receptor to allow things that bind to it to work better. The opposite of that, which is kind of like Emperor Palpatine in this movie, but kind of not, so I didn't include him, is a negative allosteric modulator. So that's something that binds to the side of the receptor, changes the shape, and allows and makes it harder for things to bind to the receptor, and they work less well. This is why CBD makes you feel less high if you've like taken too much THC. CBD is a negative allosteric modulator at CB1. Change the shape, THC binds less well, you feel less high. I also included synthesizing enzymes just to like continue on the road towards explaining the endocannabinoid system. So a synthesizing enzyme would be an enzyme that triggers the creation of those ligands in the endocannabinoid system. So it's like responsible for giving birth to the agonists or antagonists in the system. In this case, Princess Leia, if she didn't send that message, Luke would have never gotten it, he never would have gone and done the thing. So she's kind of responsible for like the whole thing being born, which is pretty cool. It's not a ligand though. All right, and then as a bonus, we have Darth Vader, who's an inverse agonist. We won't really get much into inverse agonists in this particular presentation, but it is another important function that compounds can have. So if an agonist activates the cell and tells the cell, do your thing, go and do it, an inverse agonist does the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. It tells the cell, do the opposite thing. If the cell wants to usually go to the right, an inverse agonist will be like, go to the left. And that's what happens in our bodies. We get inverse agonism. Very, very weird. Okay, in addition to all of these things, binaries are all false, including how things bind to receptors. So something doesn't just simply bind and tell the cell to go. They can bind more or less well, which is why allosteric modulation is a thing. But compounds in and of themselves have a binding affinity. So you have a scale from a partial agonist to a full agonist. And this is important because THC and one of the endocannabinoids are partial agonists at the endocannabinoid receptors. Other things are full agonists at the cannabinoid receptors, and they have different effects. This is important when you're looking at research. A lot of research that's done in the US isn't done using THC. It's done using a synthetic cannabinoid, oftentimes Win55, which is a full agonist at CB1 and CB2. Pretty good stand-in, not perfect. Okay, so partial agonist, partial antagonist, full antagonist, allosteric modulation, synthesizing enzyme, lots of words. Star Wars. Very important. Okay, we're gonna move on to endocannabinoids. Okay, so endocannabinoids are compounds that our bodies produce that bind to the cannabinoid receptors. There are over a dozen that have been discovered so far, but we really only know about 2 of them. And they were the first 2 discovered, anandamide, or AEA, and 2-arachidinyl glycerol, which I like to say because I had to learn how to say it, or 2-AG, which is what everyone calls it. I like to include the images of the 3-dimensional shape of the molecules just to highlight again that these are 3-dimensional shapes binding in 3-dimensional pockets, and that's why they can bind more or less well. If there's a little candy cane shape in the receptor and that little candy cane goes in there perfectly, it is a full agonist. But if it's like not quite a perfect candy cane, it's just a little bit of a candy cane, but it still kind of goes in there and activates it just a little bit, that's a partial agonist. That's why it's important. So, you know how you can go for a run, some of you, some of us, not me, and after like a little while, the first mile, the first 30 minutes, you start to feel really good, but only for a little while. That's a runner's high. And they have shown that after 30 minutes or more of running, men experienced a doubling of anandamide in their brains. So this compound, anandamide, is probably responsible for the runner's high, which is pretty cool. The reason that a runner's high lasts very, very short amount of time is that when endocannabinoids are released, their enzymes to break them down are also released. And so they're started to be broken down like immediately. Very, very short effects, but still very important. Anandamide is Sanskrit? Oh man, I forgot. It means supreme joy. So the actual name of the molecule means what it feels like, which is pretty amazing. So 2-AG, second compound found, seems to be like more expressed in more tissues at higher concentrations than anandamide, and they often play like opposing roles. Like when one of them does one thing, like it is anti-inflammatory, and this is the case for, I'm gonna make it up, I talk about it later. I think anandamide is largely anti-inflammatory. 2-AG can be pro-inflammatory, and we'll talk about why that's important. I want to like put that out there, that these 2 compounds are both ligands of the cannabinoid receptors. They both bind and activate the cannabinoid receptors, but they can have opposing effects, which is important when we talk about what the endocannabinoid system does on a large scale. Okay, metabolic enzymes. Oh no, oh, that wasn't supposed to, okay, well, there's a whole list of compounds. You don't really need to know them. The most important are the catabolic enzymes, which are the enzymes that break these 2 endocannabinoids down, Pha and maglipase. They're released at the same time as the endocannabinoids. They break them down, they eat them. If you adjust the levels of those enzymes, you end up adjusting the levels of endocannabinoids, and that's some of how like this medicine works. So when we're talking about the endocannabinoid system, these 3 parts, the receptors, the endocannabinoids, and the enzymes that synthesize them and break them down, work in concert throughout the body. So if you change one of those 3 parts, you will end up with changes in the other 2 parts. It balances itself. And so these are all therapeutic targets for medicine, and there are different research projects going on at manipulating each one of these things for different reasons. Okay, so this is the important question. What does it do? It's a really hard question to answer, especially breaking it down in rash generalities. Like we talked about earlier, the endocannabinoid system is expressed everywhere in the body, and it does a lot of different things. But in general, it seems to encourage the body to maintain homeostasis. So it regulates systems. It is like, it's like a thermostat, and I stole this metaphor from Martin Lee, my boss. So the endocannabinoid system is like a master thermostat. It takes all the information from the different systems, and it makes sure that all of those systems are running in concert. What I was saying about the pro and anti-inflammatory effect of the endocannabinoids earlier, that plays directly into this. So, you know when you get a fever, your body's trying to kill the germs. It's really important that, like, you know, they don't take root in your body and take over and then you die. It's not good. So it raises the temperature, tries to kill the germs. That's awesome. But then, okay, cool, the germs die. But your body can't stay hot forever. Then your cells will die, which also results in death, not good. So there needs to be a system to bring that system down, to bring the temperature down. So it's like that, but everywhere, with every system. It's super interesting to try and research any of this online because it's like the endocannabinoid system and the gut, the endocannabinoid system and the respiratory system, the endocannabinoid system and the reproductive system. And it's just like, do. It does this everywhere. Everywhere. It's really, really amazing. And in order to illustrate this, I decided to look at two conditions and talk about what happens with the endocannabinoid system in those conditions. The first being pain and inflammation. So this is one of the primary things that it is thought that the endocannabinoid system regulates in the body. Inflammation is implicated in a lot of different diseases. Neurodegenerative diseases might be related to inflammation. Autoimmune diseases might be related to inflammation. And so finding new and novel ways to reduce inflammation is really important. And the endocannabinoid system presents a really awesome therapeutic target for that. First things first, CB1 modulates pain perception. What I said earlier about it changing your emotional perception of pain, super important. But it doesn't seem to have much of a role to play in inflammation, maybe a little bit. CB2, on the other hand, really seems to play a major role in modulating inflammation. When anandamide and 2-AG bind to it, they can have those opposing effects. And yeah, one of the things that is important to note now, as before, is it's really hard to find a compound that activates only one of these two things. So when you get CB1 activation, you also get CB2 activation and vice versa. A lot of research is being done to look for a CB2 agonist that doesn't activate CB1, and it's going okay. But, you know, we're still learning. Once they do that, scientists are gonna lose their stuff. It's gonna be a big deal. Okay, so one of the reasons that we know CB2 has an impact on inflammation is they designed a mouse that didn't have CB2 receptors, which is something that researchers do with mice all the time. They delete different receptors or systems or whatever in order to see what it does. And those mice had such elevated levels of inflammation that they ended up having tissue damage and dying. So CB2 seems to be very important in regulating inflammation throughout the body. Yeah, all right. Yes, moving on to, actually I wanted to touch on, no, that's okay. All right, metabolism and energy. This was another really interesting thing that I guess every system is an interesting system that the endocannabinoid system interacts with, but this was another really interesting one. So the endocannabinoid system starts developing in fetuses really early on, by week 14. And it seems to be responsible. Endocannabinoids play a role in embryo implantation in the uterus, and then when a baby is born, endocannabinoids play a role in suckling. Anandamide is found in breast milk, and when you take anandamide out of breast milk, mouse pups in the mouse model just didn't suckle and they died. So endocannabinoid system is really important from the very beginning for feeding. And CB1 seems to be the real star of this whole aspect of the system. It modulates every aspect of feeding from finding food, to the eating of food, to the processing of food, to feeling satiated. CB1 is implicated in all of that. CB2 seems to oppose those effects. So this is another of those like homeostatic things. CB1 does one thing, CB2 does the other thing. One of the endocannabinoids does one thing, the other endocannabinoid does another thing. The opposite thing. But CB1 really seems to be important in feeding. When we are hungry and we look at food, the endocannabinoids in our system go way up. They start going up like slowly over the day, but then we look at something we want to eat, they just like pop up. And then we eat, and then they start to go slowly down. Now, when this system is dysregulated, you end up with disease, namely obesity on the one hand or anorexia on the other hand. People who are obese will have the same reaction. They'll have a spike of endocannabinoids when they see food that they want to eat, but they don't like go down as quickly or as much as people of normal weight. And so that could mean like maybe they're not feeling as satiated, they still feel hungry even though they shouldn't be hungry. It's just not satisfying in the same way. On the other hand, people with anorexia are shown food, maybe it's even their favorite food, no spike in endocannabinoids. They eat, no spike in endocannabinoids. So it's just like they obviously aren't having a pleasure reaction to eating food. So manipulating the endocannabinoid system could be a really good therapeutic target. Unfortunately, it can have downstream effects. So there was a drug, rimonabant, which blocked the CB1 receptor that was approved for treating obesity, and it was approved and then quickly withdrawn from the market for negative side effects like suicidality. So it's not as simple as just like introducing something that blocks one or the other receptor. Like it's a complex system, so when you do one thing, it does that everywhere and can have really negative side effects. But on the other hand, it can have really positive side effects. Cool, that's what I wanted to say about that. All right, this is the last section, and probably most important to you guys. What do you do with all this information? It's a lot of letters and numbers and words. How do you impact your system? How do you impact your endocannabinoid system? There's the obvious answer. Let's talk a little bit about how cannabinoids interact with the endocannabinoid system. So THC is the most common cannabinoid found in cannabis, something that many of you probably enjoyed tonight. And it is binding to both the CB1 and CB2 receptor throughout your body and doing some really cool things like making you feel high and maybe making you feel less pain or less nauseous or like just better in general. It does some really, really cool things. CBD, on the other hand, does not bind to CB1 or CB2 receptors. It is a negative allosteric modulator at CB1, which is how it makes you feel less high if you've had too much. And it has an impact on a lot of different receptors and channels throughout the body, which is where we start getting into the non-classical endocannabinoid system. So CB1 and CB2 are a super small part of the picture. There are probably one of the most important ones is the TRP family of receptors. TRPV1, the vanilloid receptor, which is what capsaicin binds to in order to make like the heat feeling, is CBD also binds to it. And it binds to and affects a lot of different TRP receptors. TRP receptors modulate temperature sensation throughout the body. And so it can be really effective for helping with pain, just like capsaicin cream is effective for dealing with pain, but without that burning feeling, which is pretty amazing. But the TRP family of receptors isn't currently considered to be part of the endocannabinoid system, though that might be changing. Yeah, all right. There's also other ways to manipulate your endocannabinoid system. So there's cannabinomimetic compounds. This is a fun word. It just means compounds that act like cannabinoids. Dr. Ethan Russo actually wrote a paper about this. There are a bunch of compounds found in a lot of different plants that activate one or another of the CB receptors or affect the enzymes that break down the endocannabinoids. Beta-caryophyllene is probably the most interesting of these compounds because it is a selective CB2 agonist. So talking earlier about how things are not selectively activating CB1 or CB2, if they activate one, they activate the other, beta-caryophyllene seems to only activate CB2, which is really cool. It does that at really high dosages. The levels they were looking at were like 25 to 50 milligrams per kilogram, which is a lot. It's like 1,200 to 3,000 milligrams of beta-caryophyllene in order to get that effect. But that's in mice and not in humans. There's also another compound found in black pepper that I'm not even going to try and pronounce. It's a Fa inhibitor. So Fa breaks down anandamide. It's released at the same time. Anandamide is responsible for the runner's high, makes you feel good. Fa breaks it down, gets rid of that feeling. If you inhibit Fa, anandamide sticks around for longer, which means you feel good for longer, which is really cool. So black pepper, again, you get in both of those compounds, which is pretty amazing. People have looked at a bunch of different plants to look for cannabinoids, in particular cannabinoid-like compounds. They found one in kava kava. It seems to activate the CB1 receptor, which makes sense if you've ever had kava kava. Definitely makes you feel high, but not as high as weed. Maca, Fa inhibitor, does that thing again. Anandamide sticks around for longer. And actually, echinacea, one of the compounds in it is a CB2 agonist, which means it activates those immunomodulatory effects throughout the body that CB2 is responsible for. So it could be partially responsible for why echinacea can be effective as like an immune booster. Another way that you can affect or impact your endocannabinoid system, electroacupuncture, which is not the most common form of acupuncture, but still fairly common, will boost levels of endocannabinoids in your system pretty significantly. They'll double. Stress reduces endocannabinoids in your system. There's a direct correlation between cortisol and endocannabinoids, which is awesome for Americans. So if you reverse stress, you will start to elevate your levels of endocannabinoids again. So things like meditation and yoga could help bring endocannabinoids back up to a level that is healthy, as opposed to where most of us probably live, which is far too stressed out. Also, interestingly, massage doubled the amount of anandamide found circulating in the body, which was pretty cool. So it's not just someone like getting really deep into those muscles that feels good. It's actually your brain being like, feel happy. Blah. So, get a massage. All right, other considerations. The endocannabinoid dome, which really rolls off the tongue, endocannabinoid dome, or as Martin likes to say, the endocannabidiome, which actually does roll off the tongue, is that larger system of receptors and compounds and enzymes that cannabinoids, endo and plant-based cannabinoids interact with. So not just CB1 and CB2, but the TRP family of receptors. There's also the opioid receptors, mu and delta opioid receptors. CBD interacts with them, modulates them, makes the opioids, either endo or synthetic, work better. PPAR, there's a bunch of different receptors also found throughout your body, responsible for a lot of different things that cannabinoids interact with. And GPCRs, there are 3 GPCRs that are all claim to be the next CB3 receptor, but we'll see which one actually wins. GPR55 is particularly interesting, I think. It's expressed it regulates bone growth. So an overexpression of GPR55 is found in people with osteoporosis, which is not good. Fortunately, CBD is an antagonist at GPR55, so it can help bring that down, which is pretty amazing. And on the other hand, THC seems to be an agonist at GPR55. So, you win some, you lose some. And then GPR18, another really interesting cannabinoid receptor potentially, is actually THC has a stronger affinity for GPR18 than it does for CB1 or CB2, and it could be responsible for the anti-nausea effects that THC is sort of famous for, at least in like the chemotherapy world. Endocannabinoid tone. This term is thrown around a lot now. And basically it refers to the level of receptors, ligands, and enzymes that are circulating throughout your body. it is important to be aware that this is a term that's thrown around, but it's really poorly defined in the literature. Basically, there is likely like a good level for all of those things to be at, and if things are overexpressed or underexpressed, then you get dysregulation. So a dysregulated endocannabinoid system results in disease most of the time. Okay, that was a lot of information. Oh no. Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. I get this question all the time, like, where do I learn more? And there are a couple of resources online. Project CBD is one of the only ones that's relatively accessible for people without a scientific background. And I had that on my presentation before I worked for Project CBD. I use PubMed and ResearchGate, which are the databases of scientific white papers. A lot of those things are open source. If you actually want to dig into the science of it, highly recommend going to PubMed and checking it out. Type in endocannabinoid system, see what comes up, see what you can read online for free. It's a really amazing resource. And your tax dollars fund a lot of those research projects, so read about them. Some researchers to keep an eye out for, when you start reading a bunch of research, names pop up again and again. Ethan, you introduced me to the endocannabinoid system, so thank you. Much appreciated. Dr. Ethan Russo, Dr. John McParlin, these are sort of like in order of accessibility too. Vincenzo De Marzo has written extensively about the endocannabinoid system. He's based in Italy, would highly recommend. Raphael Mechoulam, actually a really accessible writer. He's the guy who elucidated the structure of THC in 1964. C.C. Hillard, Alan Howlett, both amazing researchers who've written extensively about the endocannabinoid system. Check them out. And with that, have many slides. Thank you.
All right, so we've got time for a handful of questions.
Cool.
But we can. Oh, isn't that nice? Yeah. Totally.
It's so weird to not see people when you're talking.
I know. Right? All right, so we've got time for a handful of questions. Yes. So yes, Susie.
Yes. You mentioned that cariophylline is a CB2 agonist.
Mm-hmm.
Would you happen to know, is myrcene one as well?
Nope.
Or you know,
So I looked into myrcene. There's a lot of theories about how myrcene like thins the blood-brain barrier or makes THC work better, and that is not substantiated in the literature, which is not to say that it's not true. There's just no research to support it.
But do we know what it does do? Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Do we know? Has that research not just really been done yet?
Yeah, a lot of the research on terpenes is based on aromatherapy studies. So these are studies where a small amount of a terpene is distributed into the air of a room, and then people are asked how they feel. This is how we know like linalool is calming because it's the most common terpene in lavender. There are a couple of studies looking at how terpenes interact with our bodies, the pharmacology, like what they do when they get in our bodies, but they're really rare. So we don't actually know a lot about terpenes. There are a lot of theories about terpenes, though.
I just asked because as a grower, I found that plants that had a high percentage of both cariophylline and myrcene together had a very specific, happy, giggly effect on people.
Ooh. Oh. I mean, it's worth looking, and like, it's one of those things where I agree with you. There's like definitely a correlation between effect and the terpene constellation, but that research, it isn't public yet.
Another question. Yes, in the back there.
Yeah, if you take a large amount of THC and a large amount of CBD at the same time, and the THC is not necessarily uptaking the way it should because of the CBD, if over a period of time, is the THC being broken down at all while that's happening? Or is it being stored and uptaking slower until the CBD goes away?
Excellent question.
Yeah, because I've had an experience where I'm very powerful eye after taking CBD and THC together in a large amount. It happened at the end of the eye.
I mean, so CBD can extend the duration of a high for sure, but I'm not sure about the metabolism of large amounts of THC. I mean, anecdotally, it would appear that somehow it's being stored in the body and not broken down, although that The enzymes that break down THC in the liver do so in small packets, but I'm not sure what the pace of that is. Yeah.
This is really interesting from what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I got one for you. So we're all big fans of whole plant medicine here, right? And so, but CBD is not really produced whole plant in the market very well, right?
Yes.
Either people are manufacturing it and they're extracting the CO2, which is no longer whole plant, really. And so there, THC is abundant and cheap, but CBD is less so because everybody's growing THC for the rec side, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now though, we've got all this CBD coming in from the medical hemp market, right? And so people are finding kind of a tweener to take their regular THC-based medicine and then spike it with CBD from hemp.
Mm-hmm.
How similar is taking CBD and spiking your whole plant like ethanol hash oil, right?
Yeah.
How close to whole plant does that get as far as efficacy goes?
I mean, it would get pretty close. I mean, it would depend on, because whole plant medicine changes from plant to plant, it would depend on what you're extracting it from and sort of what compounds are of interest to you. But just like a whole plant extract, like adding CBD to a whole plant extract still retains all of the wonderful effects of the whole plant extract. It's just, if it was a CBD based whole plant extract, you would hope that all of those things that are already you're already taking are in that extract as well. So it would be pretty similar, I guess.
Right on. So it's definitely worth using.
Yes.
And the question is whether or not the supporting novel cannabinoids of CBD are also in that other plant.
Right, exactly. Yeah, although it does seem like THC and CBD have a particularly synergistic relationship. There was a study that is being done at Harvard, which is amazing. So there was this study a while ago about public speaking and how CBD impacted anxiety induced by public speaking, and it was effective, but the doses were like 300 and 600 milligrams, which is a lot of CBD. And so people would always cite that study as being like, oh, CBD is an anti-anxiety compound. And it's like, well, no one's taking 300 milligrams of CBD. But Stacey Gruber at Harvard is in the middle of a study where she used 30 milligrams of CBD and like 0.3 milligrams of THC and found anti-anxiety effects for both chronic and acute anxiety.
And even though it's hard to get it in the market so far, we've actually been doing patient studies all summer on CBG, which has a fantastic anti-anxiety component, but specifically for social anxiety and public speaking, it makes you feel capable, like you can handle this. So the first, real commercial CBG is being grown this summer, and it'll be everywhere this fall. But watch for it. Yes, Mr. Obama.
I would submit that whole plant, full spectrum describes the workflow more than the plant material used. So you could mix 1 part cannabis, 1 part hemp, do a full spectrum whole plant workflow, whether it's ethanol or what have you. I don't think that whole plant describes what material you're using, but an attempt to pull cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, and everything else out of there as part of a whole synergetic package.
All right. Do a question?
Yeah, what the second thing you mentioned, CBG. I don't have any idea what that is, and I specifically came to this seminar to learn about something that might be useful for the exact application you described, for anxiety and public speaking and so forth. Not for me, because I can tell a joke if you like, but anyway, what is it?
Do you want to explain CBG?
CBG is the parent cannabinoid, so most other cannabinoids that develop in the plant develop from CBG. It's cannabigerol is what it stands for. It's present in higher quantities in immature plants, although now there are breeders who are growing plants that will only express CBG. It is a secondary cannabinoid. It's not particularly well studied yet. It seems to have, anecdotally, anti-anxiety effects, It's also being looked at for its anti-nausea effects. That's sort of what I've seen in the literature about it. So, but
It also helps with neuromuscular pain we're finding. And the studies that we did on Vashon this summer, it's really crazy because we get this lightening of neuromuscular pain and an increase of the feeling of capability, like I can overcome this, which somehow also helps with the pain, and they're together. So anyway, again, it's all anecdotal. It's just us making up ethanol hash oil, handing it out with questionnaires. So it's like that.
But CBD is definitely also a compound of interest for anxiety, and one that has more substantial scientific literature associated with
And
it.
that can be without a THC component. Or
Yes,
a very
although you might
very
need
minor.
a very minor one. Yeah, if you use an isolate of CBD, regardless of condition, you might need a much larger dose than taking something that has a small amount of THC or a full spectrum extract. Yeah.
Got it, thank you.
Is there anybody trying to make like some kind of medication for anti-inflammatory that can help with anything? I guess. Like, 'cause it
yes, in what
sounds like I should
context?
stay away from some things that would be the opposite of anti-inflammatory.
Oh, okay. So, one point I didn't actually touch on. All phytocannabinoids have been shown to be anti-inflammatory, but not pro-inflammatory. Only endocannabinoids have both effects, and researchers don't really know why phytocannabinoids, plant-based cannabinoids, don't have a pro-inflammatory effect. They've only had an anti-inflammatory effect on every cell. So I would not worry too much about that. Yeah.
Yes.
So is anybody looking into the evolutionary advantages to the plants for making all these wonderful things?
I tried to write an article about that. So the theory, cannabinoids are terpenophenolic compounds. They're basically terpenes, which might have evolved for a number of different reasons. So they're all expressed in the trichomes on the flower. Trichomes also evolved for maybe a couple of different things, potentially to protect against the sun, potentially to protect against pests. A lot of terpenes are like bitter. A lot of these compounds, cannabinoids included, are in a family of compounds that are very commonly produced by plants to regulate a lot of systems like growth and cell life cycles. So there's any number of reasons that they might have
But nobody
produced.
really knows.
No one really knows. Yeah.
Saber.
About, I want to say, it was like 7 years ago now. The academic community was about one protein motif away from having fully documented the metabolic pathway to create THC and CBD and all the other cannabinoids. Have you seen any research where they found that final protein motif? Do you know if it's been released?
I have literally no idea. I'm sorry.
I'll keep going.
We got time for one more question. Yes, sir. We love Susie, but she did already ask one. So if you're pressing, we can't. Otherwise, we'll go to Susie.
Just a quick one.
Go ahead.
So with the rain coming, if we were interested in trying to get some CBG, how early do you think we could pick things to try and get some CBG? I don't want to pick too early.
I mean, you want your trichomes to develop for sure. You might know this more than I do.
I haven't actually worked with early picked cultivars, and I don't even think that homework's been done yet. I've only used plant material that has been bred specifically to only express CBG. So I think, what?
We'll experiment.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
so people have been actually doing that in hemp culture right now a lot, picking every week and running analytics. And I mean, Jerry Whiting's behind you is doing.
With Analytical 360's help to track the maturation curves of THC and CBD.
So we're gonna know more of this about a lot. We are gonna know a lot more about this after this summer.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we are gonna move on. Thank you, Zoe Sigman.